Okay, good morning. We're here with Barry Kelley of Impact 2 Molex Company. We're this episode of Spilling the Tea with 4C. We'll be talking about Molex's technology and actual emissions versus compliant emissions. Versus compliant emissions would be the storage tank regulations require internal or external floating roof tank. One of the components of those tanks is a PVRV. That PVRV is mechanically actuated, has a pallet valve, and if that pallet valve sticks, then it's venting all the time, which it shouldn't be. You think, well, maybe that's just an exception or maintenance, a malfunction, a startup shutdown, whatever you want to call it, excess emission. But in reality, if your entity has 10,000 tanks and each of those tanks have a pallet valve get stuck once every 5 years, that's a couple thousand pallet valves stuck per year. And if you break that down on a per month basis, all of a sudden that becomes a lot of pallet valves and a lot of stuck emissions. The question of whether that's really a malfunction, upset, startup shutdown, or excess emission that's subject to some kind of affirmative defense can get called into question. So there's a development of a whole series of technologies that can see actual emissions. So ostensibly you're in compliance because you've installed the proper kind of tank, but your actual emissions may put that compliance into a gray area. And the EPA is in a habit of resolving gray areas with $100 million consent decrees and billions and billions of dollars across the petroleum and refining industry. And we've been through this. We're now on our third cycle of consent decrees. And so there's a point where these actual emissions start to matter more than the regulation itself. We need to just find the emissions and reduce the emissions. That's something that we could talk about that your technology can do. Are there other examples like the pallet valve sticking that the technology has found when it's been put in place?
Yeah, there's some great examples of that. One of the beauties of the system is it is monitoring 24/7, and it doesn't really care what the source is, right? It doesn't care that it's a regulated LDAR source or it's not a regulated LDAR source. It's just looking for those emissions and how they impact the site. So sometimes the leaks are things that are in a traditional LDAR program and we would say they're covered by the program. Let's take an example of a connector under insulation. That's a regulated component. If you find it leaking, you have to do a 5 and 15-day repair, but it's exempt from routine monitoring. Those are great examples. On the first pilot, as soon as we turned on the system, that was one of the first things we found was a 100,000 ppm leaker that was under insulation. Wasn't showing anything that you could see from an AVO perspective, but that's a great example of ones that we turn it on, we get the detection, we go find it, we repair it, and that's an emission that could have gone on for a long time. Sure, eventually it would get worse and bad enough we would be able to find it with the AVO and we would fix it and follow our protocols, but it's that early warning piece too that lets you know what's out there. We're not having to go strip insulation and manually monitor all these. The system is just looking and alerting us when there's an anomaly that we need to investigate further.
Yeah, and there's certainly a safety component to that. We know that some number of the explosions are due to the corrosion associated with that leak under the insulation. So that's also a process safety management issue.
For sure, and it's pretty interesting. A lot of the plant managers, a lot of the folks that we deal with really value the Molex LDSN, their leak detection sensor network and their fence line as much or more from a process safety perspective and personal safety perspective as they do about the initial thing that we were set out to try to solve, right? Which is I don't like LDAR the way I have to do it. Is there a better way to do it? But the process safety value is really highlighted by folks that are in the leadership there.
Yeah, and to take that even a little further is whenever there's a leak, it's a failure of something. We don't ever design things to leak. So identifying those failures, and they can then be incorporated into a better design, incorporated into better work practices to eliminate the source altogether in the future, rather than just simply find leaks and fix them, because with your technology, you have the temporal component. With a traditional Method 21 leak detection and repair program, you're monitoring every 90 days. You have a monitoring event, you find a leak. The problem is you don't know when that leak occurred. You don't know the day the leak that leak grew to be a problem. If you knew the day, you may be able to go back and tie in some of the root cause and understand how we prevent emissions from occurring in the future to begin with.
That's very true, and the knowledge that the data brings and is presented in a way that can help you make decision is very powerful for this. So, for example, on the fence line monitoring system, where the RSR requirement is a 2-week passive sample, you send that out to a lab, it comes back. Now you're trying to figure out, hey, why did I have an elevated reading from 4 weeks ago, right? So the beauty of this system in that, when you're using it in that fence line perspective, is it can give you real-time data. We were able, as an example there, to go back and see, hey, where did that peak occur? Oh, something was going on between 12:05 and 12:35 on this day. Let's go see what activities were going, what was the state of the plant. And what we found is it was related to barge activity, right? So now we can look at, let's refresh on our process. How do we disconnect? How do we purge lines? In that particular case, they actually came up with an engineered solution where they're using butterfly valves, shorter lines to help reduce that. But it's only because we were able to use the data to show us the issue and then to make an improvement to